All right, so this is a what I would do mock draft and not what I think is going to happen mock draft. At number 1, I'm going to take Abdul Carter, the edge rusher from Penn State. I think he's simply put the best player in this draft. So, with that said, that franchise guy, one of the best YouTubers for football, says that Carter is in the Myles Garrett tier for an edge rushing prospect. And this is said by him, but it's also said by, basically everybody. There are a lot of similarities between him and Micah Parsons. They're both freak 1-year edge rushers that converted from linebacker. Hopefully, Abdul Carter wasn't sexually harassing his college teammates like Parsons did, but the comparison is a lot deeper than just them playing for Penn State and wearing number 11 at edge rusher. They're both just complete freaks of nature athletically. They have everything you would want. They play with a similar level of intensity, I feel. And the reason I think Carter is the best player is because I do factor in heavily positional value. So, being an edge rusher, that is a premium position. And compared to who many would argue is the best player in this draft, Travis Hunter, Abdul Carter did better in 1 year as an edge rusher at a pretty high end school in Penn State versus what Travis Hunter did as both a wide receiver and as a cornerback, according to their PFF grades. Carter got a 91 in his 1 year at edge rusher. The highest Hunter got at either wide receiver or corner was an 88. And Hunter, you know, some offense to him, he was playing really bad competition. Carter was not. Hunter, the peak of his competition was at Colorado, which is a low end school. And the, lower point was at Jackson State, which I think a lot of people don't realize is, a school or has a football team if they know it's a school. No offense to them. But yeah, Penn State is a much better program. They play a lot better teams. And Abdul Carter did better, according to PFF, in 1 year than Hunter did in 3 years at two different positions. You could argue that, Hunter could be better because he's only playing one position, but he had two chances and he wasn't as good as Carter in, one position. So Carter here is the pick. The Titans, I don't really care too much about the position fit for the team because the Titans are just terrible. They kind of need everything. And, first you accumulate the talent, then you make it work, in my opinion. So, edge rusher matters a lot. They do need edge rusher, so that helps a bit. But that's not really the driving force for this. At number 2, again, I do really highly value positional value. So the pick is going to be quarterback Cam Ward. PFF is wildin' this year, and putting Cam Ward as their 21st ranked player. So, what's the deal with Ward? He is somebody that, again, quoting that franchise guy, I'm not going to do this for every pick, but I really liked what he said in regards to the first two players. Ward has top 10 potential at, far and away the most important position. That's not always the case. In a draft class that features Malik Willis and Kenny Pickett, you could argue Willis had top 10 potential just based on his athleticism, but, that is like threading the needle at the fullest extent. Willis was not refined. He played at very low end competition. Ward, he didn't play, at powerhouse schools up until his time in Miami, and he completely turned around the college basically by himself in 1 year. He was absolutely incredible, and he showed that he absolutely belongs. He has a solid arm. He's a very quick processor. He has great pocket awareness. He's not the absolute highest end of athlete for quarterback. There are a lot of quarterbacks nowadays that are just, in another life. They're a running back or a wide receiver or a cornerback. But, Ward's not quite that, but he's definitely plus in athleticism. And, the fact that he's throwing with just incredible anticipation and it's just all around a really sound quarterback. Another thing that franchise guy said that I really think resonates well is that Ward is not going this high because the quarterback class is lacking and the draft overall doesn't have the superstar talent that a lot of drafts do. Ward is a bona fide, first overall type of pick. He thinks in basically any draft, he'd be, I think he said top 10, but I would argue, top 5 or so type of pick. That's the talent he is. The only knock on him is that Ward can be a bit greedy. As I mentioned, solid arm and plus athlete. He's not, this Josh Allen type of arm or Lamar Jackson speed. So I think there will be times where he's just a little bit too greedy and thinks he can, fit a pass in that just he doesn't have the arm talent for necessarily. But all in all, a very good prospect and, deserving of this pick, I believe. The Browns, they got the sexual predator, Deshaun Watson, still around. He's been just absolutely dreadful, almost as bad on the field as he is off the field. That's saying a lot. So, don't let that get in the way. Don't let Kenny Pickett get in the way. Get your quarterback. Hopefully, it's the Browns. They could have the absolute best prospect ever at quarterback, and they still probably mess it up. But try again with Ward. All right. So at number 3, even though I dunked on him a little bit earlier before regarding the Abdul Carter comparison, we're going to go with cornerback / wide receiver Travis Hunter. I do agree with him being listed as a cornerback. I think he's a fair bit better at corner than he is wide receiver. He's arguably the best player in this draft. I think there's, again, not too great of an argument for that. But there's definitely, something to be said about a dude that can play at a very high level at two positions that don't really correspond with each other all that well. It's one thing if you're a great outside corner and you can play nickel or, just play safety, say. It's another thing to be playing both sides of the ball. That's something that, hasn't been done since like the 50s. So I don't think there's any chance at all that Hunter plays meaningful snaps at both positions. I think you have a very fluid, fast athlete with, a weak body that could build muscle and, just add some weight, hopefully, so he doesn't get out physicaled all the time. He also has weak competition. So there are some knocks against him for sure, but he is an A1 ball hawk. He is genuinely, about as good as it gets for a cornerback or even a wide receiver in attacking the ball. I think Derek Stingley is the only modern cornerback that's really had similar ball skills to Hunter. And Stingley was so well regarded for his ball skills. So that should tell you where Hunter is with that. The reason I'm against Hunter as a wide receiver is I think, cornerback and wide receiver, I'd have a slight preference probably in most cases for cornerback because I think there's just so many good receivers in the league. It's very important to be able to have somebody that can shut the opposing team's best one down. But, I think they're relatively, similar in value. The analytics bear that out as well. So that's not really the issue. I just think as a player, Hunter projects a lot better as a corner. He ran pretty unrefined routes at Colorado, and he ran like 3 different routes. That's a slight exaggeration, but not as much as you might think because he does have such a good reputation. He, again, is great at mossing players. He is great with run after catch, but I think you would just be wasting him as a wide receiver by saying, completely up your route running game and, attack the ball at a very high level, but not like a historic level as a wide receiver. If you put him at corner, he's going to attack the ball about as good as anybody ever has. So I like Hunter at corner. Again, I'm not really, factoring in too much about positional need, but the Giants do definitely need a corner. So I think Hunter makes sense in a variety of ways. Next, but we're going to go with Tet McMillan from Arizona, the wide receiver. The Patriots, their offseason approach, I think will command a video of its own. Like it or not, they haven't really hammered away at their offensive needs. And McMillan, he can put that to bed a fair amount because, the signing of Stephon Diggs, you get a very high-end wide receiver too, more than likely. And McMillan can definitely be a wide receiver 1. So, there's still work to be done, for sure. But McMillan, this is one of the last times I mention him, that franchise guy. He has him as, somebody that's in contention for being the number 1 player in the draft. Initially, I thought that was a bit outlandish, but I think, there are a lot of people that think very highly of him. There's also a lot of people that are pretty low on him, but I think a lot of their analysis is a little bit lazy. And by that, I mean they see this, like 6'5", pretty well built. He's a little bit lanky, but, he's not a string bean wide receiver. And they're like, yeah, he can't really run routes. So, they have some bias against him. I don't see that at all. And that franchise guy who's great at evaluating players, particularly wide receivers, he absolutely nailed the Drake London draft. He had such good analysis on basically the entire first round. 4 wide receivers, I remember. He thought London was a stud. McMillan is pretty similar to London, not the exact same, because yes, they are big-bodied wide receivers that have some run after catch capacities, and they can run routes pretty smoothly for their size. McMillan has a fair bit more juice in downfield speed than London did. That's not to say that McMillan thereby is guaranteed to be miles better than London, but that does matter a fair bit. And that franchise guy said he's the number 4 wide receiver he's ever evaluated. I don't remember exactly how long he's been evaluating prospects, but it's several years. It's definitely at least 5. So, that carries a lot of weight. His comparison was AJ Green. I haven't seen anybody else say that. I think that's a pretty good comp. Definitely the high-end comp. Green doesn't always get, regarded as well as he should. He was an absolutely exceptional player, didn't really have great quarterback play, and he still put up just ridiculous numbers. McMillan, I think, could be in that same vein. He is great at mossing players, He's quick, just in general, but especially for his size. Again, run after catch is really good. All of his routes are positively ran. They are pretty darn smooth, and even when they're not just picture perfect, he's still going to have the chance to come down with the ball because he's just bigger and can have a wider catch radius than the defenders going against him. I think McMillan is the perfect guy for the Patriots because you have Drake May. You need to see if he's the guy moving forward or not. You don't need to see exactly this year, but it's better to get, a jump on things than it is to be in the fifth year, giving him the fifth year option, still not really knowing. If you get McMillan, if Diggs is healthy, you have a viable receiving room. Right now, I'd still say it's not viable, to be completely honest. So McMillan is kind of a must in that regard, but I think just straight up, he's also the best player you can draft here. So McMillan, just all around, fantastic player, fantastic fit. I like him a lot. Next, we have the next best player on the board, being defensive interior Mason Graham. I've seen a fair amount of people argue that he's a blue chip prospect, which is to say that he's the highest level of prospect where it's, basically guaranteed that he's going to be good and has the potential to be like all pro level, if that's unclear. Graham, he has great strength. He's great against the run, and he's flashed a good amount as a pass rusher. He was 7th in defensive interior pressures. So, that's a pretty high end pass rusher already. It's not 1-to-1 that if you're a good pass rusher in college, you're going to be good in the pros, but he's a good athlete. So, having production in college, being athletic, not being just clueless with what to do with your hands, and, playing with some leverage, that's a good start. I definitely don't think Graham is just this run defender that, you hope becomes a pass rusher. I think he's well on his way to being a pass rusher. And again, the Jags desperately, like about as much as any team needs a positional group, need defensive interior help. They have basically nobody you can rely on. I'm talking like throughout the entire depth chart for the interior. So Graham helps a lot. And next, we start getting away from just picking who PFF has as the best player in the draft. I will not draft a running back this highly, even if the team, completely needs one. I'm a little bit too smart for that to sound as smug as possible. Here, we're going to go with cornerback Will Johnson, not even the highest ranked cornerback according to PFF, but that's okay. I don't care what they think. I'm edgy like that. I want to, draft back-to-back Michigan players, so it's cute. Johnson, he has on the shorter end of arms, so there are a little bit of questions regarding him in press coverage. You obviously want to get the first strike in, and if you don't have perfect positioning after the footwork of the release, you want to still get a hand on the receiver to slow him down. So short arms, also for pass deflections and interceptions, of course. Those arms do definitely matter, the arm length. Also, he doesn't have the greatest long speed. So, there are some concerns with him. But I think in general, we overvalue a fair amount for speed because, there are so many great players in the league that are built on speed. If you take it away, they're going to be lesser players, of course. But there's way more players that, have average or below speed and are still great. So Johnson, I don't think speed is like, an absolute just horrible thing for him. I don't think he's like a 4.6 type of speed, but it's not the elite stuff you would ideally get. I think with him, we've seen 2 good and 1 great year in college, and I think that matters a fair bit at corner. I think it matters, at every positional group. You want to see some level of proficiency in college, but at cornerback, it's very hard to be good year to year. And Will Johnson at his worst in 3 years of starting or being a very big contributor, I think he started 3 years, he was at least a good positive corner. He also played injured in 2024. So, I don't see that as presenting an injury risk moving forward. I see that as, he still played well and he wasn't completely healthy. Again, the Raiders also do really need a cornerback. They also have one of the worst rooms for any positional group at corner, even with the signing of Eric Stokes from Green Bay. That was a very small signing. It was small because even though he drafted pretty highly, he sucked. I think he had 1 good year, but the Raiders, they need more even if Stokes does hit. Also, the last Michigan corner that was high profile to go to the Raiders being Charles Woodson. Maybe I missed somebody, but the last real big one, he panned out pretty well. And obviously that matters when you're talking about players that are drafted 20 years apart and don't play very similarly, definitely matters. So the next pick, we're not going running back again. That's yucky. We're going offensive tackle, and we're not going Will Campbell. Screw him. Not really. He's good. We're going Armand Membou. Membou is really nice athletically, and I like that he's not just somebody that's, an athlete that doesn't know what he's doing. No, he's 6'4", 327. Those are really good looks, especially the 327. That's, a big boy, hard to push around, even if he's not quite the strongest yet. He has 33.5-inch arms, which is over the 33-inch requirement for basically every team. He ran a 4.91 40. That's really good for his size. And he was PFF's number 5 tackle this year. So he's produced. He's great in pass blocking and run blocking, especially if you're running wide zone, which every team basically is doing nowadays. It's the wave. So there's not much to dislike about Membou. There's definitely the conversation between Campbell and Membou, but I think Membou provides higher upside, and he also is guaranteed to be a tackle, and specifically a right tackle. Olu Fashanu didn't have a good rookie year. Some people think he did. I don't know why that is. The stats don't reflect that at all. And, you hope he's the left tackle of the future, and you hope Membou's the right tackle of the future. So we're going with Membou here. Next, for the Panthers, you do definitely want a wide receiver here. Unfortunately, that's not, really an option. Someone said, though, on ESPN that, Matthew Golden is in the conversation for, a top 5 pick. I was absolutely blown away. That doesn't sound right at all. I don't think anybody else holds that opinion, either Matthew Golden's mom or dad or best friend or himself. No offense to him, he's just not, that type of prospect. So we have to go beyond wide receiver. Really, the offensive line, too, pretty well set in Carolina. I know it's, easy to think the Panthers suck, nothing was good about them, poverty franchise, this and that. They actually do have a pretty good offensive line. So you don't really need to go Campbell here. You do definitely need some defensive back help. So Barron would make sense. I do definitely think he's, that caliber of player to go in the top 10. But we're going to get a little bit jiggy with it. And we're going to go with Tyler Warren. You can't go wide receiver. What's the next best thing? Tight end. Warren, he worries me. There's no doubt about it. He is huge at 6'6", 260. He has great hands and yards after catch. But he worries me because he's a bit choppy with his routes. He's not very agile either. So I think that's going to persist. And he runs few routes. I think he's going to be limited in the routes he runs in the pros for sure. So that's pretty worrying. I think route running is the biggest deal for a receiving option. Obviously, if you're just going to, catch everything, that matters more. But you're going to have a lot better chance to catch something, even if your hands aren't great, if you're open. I don't think Warren's going to separate at this just absolute elite level. But I do think, there have been great tight ends that run pretty simple routes and do so with great efficiency, especially, at his size and with his run after catch ability. I'm not projecting this at all, but George Kittle doesn't run the most advanced routes. He's a bit better as an athlete than Warren is. Warren can take a little bit to get full speed and probably doesn't even have the full end speed that Kittle does, but Kittle, just run after catch demon, just vicious as a run blocker. Gronk, same thing. Did his work a lot after the catch and as a run blocker. Warren, he has the potential to be a great run blocker, honestly, one of the best at tight end with his size and overall physical profile, great strength. Right now, he's not really a good run blocker. I'd say he's below average at that. But, I don't think it's for lack of willingness, and I don't think it's for lack of body type. All right, so we have the Saints here, and even though they have the 9th pick and not the 1st pick, I think they're just in complete disarray. They have absolutely no money. They're pushing money forward, so they're going to have less money moving forward. Carr played rather well. He was top 10-ish, honestly, this year. And, Olave's good. Dealing with concussions a fair bit, though. There's so much wrong with this team. They just lost, I would say, their best defensive back with Paulson Adebo. There's a lot wrong with this team. They need A to Z, basically. So, with that said, Jahdae Barron, again, makes some sense. I do, however, think you needing a lot of things, especially, having maybe the worst offensive line this past year. They did have some injuries with Eric McCoy in particular. But, Ryan Ramczyk, not a guarantee to be healthy. He's really dealing with some pretty severe injuries, I believe, to his knees. I'm not entirely sure what the situation is, but I've heard that it's rather severe. I think Will Campbell makes sense. We stopped a little bit of a fall for him. Campbell, listed as a tackle. I don't think he's going to be a tackle. The good thing is, though, for sure, we're keeping him in Louisiana. That has to matter, a lot, of course. Not really. Campbell, the reason he's not a tackle more than likely is, and I hate this, it sounds lame to be the stats say, I do and I don't. I like presenting, the stats as well. But 32.5-inch arms just is not going to cut it. The absolute bare minimum for basically every team is 33 inches for a tackle. He's also not the most fluid. It isn't to say that he's unathletic or anything, but he's just not super fluid. So I think interior offensive line is where he's going to go. I think, around pick 9 is where you start thinking about these interior offensive linemen. And I think Campbell honestly could be a very good one because he is very fundamental. He has 2 good and 1 great year to his name. I think honestly he might just be better as, a guard than he was a tackle in college. I would still try him out at tackle early on if Ramchick can't go. Just, let Campbell maybe fall on his face a lot and, you know, just show for sure that he can't be a tackle, but tackle just matters a lot more than guard. So, try him out at tackle, see if he can do it or not. If not, you have a really good prospect at guard. For the Bears, they do need running back. And we're at the 10th pick. Maybe you say, maybe we think running back, especially with a team such as the Bears that don't have a lot of needs. No, we're not doing that. We're going with Jahdae Barron. Barron is a player I've liked for not a particularly long time. I just started liking him this year. But I really liked following his trajectory this year. He was elite at corner for Texas. And, he played a lot of good teams with a lot of good receivers. And he held up very well. He's athletic enough to play man. He does have, again, some of the shorter arms that make man coverage and press coverage in particular a bit difficult, especially on the outside. So maybe he can play nickelback a bit more. I like that versatility, though. That is so important, I think, to have a guy that can fill 2 needs. Not at the same time, more than likely. Playing inside and out is probably going to be a little bit difficult. But he is elite in zone. He's great. He really knows where to be and where the quarterback's trying to go. He could honestly even be a safety as well. I would try him at outside corner, then nickel, or vice versa. They're kind of interchangeable for the most part in value. And then I would move him to safety if he doesn't actually pan out, which I don't expect. I think he's going to be a great corner. But yeah, he could even be safety. He's a good tackler as well. Like I said, he is just so darn good in zone. He's definitely one of the better zone corners I've seen in a while. So we're going Barron for the Bears. They do definitely need a corner. The corner, I'm forgetting his name. He is, pretty bad. I think he was out of Miami. He was a 2nd-round pick. He was supposed to be a man coverage guy. He's kind of sucked, to put it bluntly. I think he's played 2 years now, so, you have a pretty good sample size of him. Barron, he can definitely be cornerback 2 to Jalen Johnson. I think he makes a ton of sense. Next, we have probably my least favorite pick of the draft. Not because they're a bad player or, reaching or, anything like that. He's just a really bad dude. We're going to go with Mike Green here. I will run his name through the mud because it deserves to be ran through the mud. But first, he's explosive. He does have that going for him. As an edge rusher, he was 7th in pressures and 1st in stops, which are just really advantageous tackles, such as, a tackle for loss or a tackle on 3rd down that prevents a 1st down, those types of deals. He ate up on bad teams. This is where the negative side comes in a little bit. He didn't really do particularly well against the good teams he played, which were kind of few and far between, being at Marshall. Overall, though, he had 2 great years, and 2 is a very relevant number with him because he's committed sexual assault twice. That's not ideal. It's something the NFL likes to turn a blind eye to, though, so, it's probably not going to lead to any trouble with him. But, yeah, he left Virginia for Marshall because he was, again, accused of sexual assault. He was accused of it in high school as well. So it's not, just one person twice. It's two different people. Yeah, he's scum, but we're taking him at 11. The Niners do need edge rushing help, and I think he's the edge rusher too in this class. You could definitely argue for like James Pierce or even Shamar Stewart, but I think Ryen provides the best combination of upside, right now production. Yeah. All right, next we have a little bit of a weird pick because, I think a lot of people see Ashton Genty. They're like, come on, dude, he's out of the top 10. He's not really, in like the super valuable range of the draft anymore. The Cowboys need a running game. They kind of have a team that's ready to compete now. They have a lot of holes in all actuality, but, I'm going to kind of favor they have a lot of holes and address that, not get the cherry on top at running back. So Genty not even in the consideration in all actuality. So what do we do here? We go with a guy that is not even the top tackle on PFF's board, but darn it, he's the top guy on my board and my heart. Not really. I don't have any particular allegiance to him. He seems like a fine dude and a great player. Kelvin Banks. So the thing with the Cowboys is right now they have one good or above, just even average or above, actually, pass blocking lineman. Their left guard. So Tyler Smith, that's his name. Took me a minute. Really not on my A game today with names. But yeah, Tyler Smith, very good guard. But, unfortunate for him, he's a guard. So, he matters a little bit less in the pass game than as a tackle would. And, 4 question marks or worse in pass pro for the offensive line. That's just not going to cut it. I also forgot to say, Texas Hook'em Horns. Should have said that for Jade Barron as well. Hook'em Horns, Jade Barron. Shout out to Bengal, the YouTuber. Much more popular than I am, so he doesn't need my shout out. But yeah, we get Kelvin Banks to the Texans, or to the Cowboys, staying in Texas. This makes perfect sense in my eyes because, Tyler Guyton was pretty bad as a rookie. Terrence Steele, pretty bad recently, especially in pass pro. Guyton projects as somebody that can be a good pass protector. He is athletic. He was good in college, pretty good in college. He's, more of an athlete pick with, good coaching you hope to get going. Banks is pretty plug and play. I think Banks could be a guard as well. There's no reason to think that he couldn't in my eyes. But, again, play him at tackle, it matters more. Steele, you move him to guard. I think he can play there. He's a good run blocker. There, the lack of fluidity and pass blocking proficiency matters a bit less. I think the offensive line gets a lot better in a lot of ways with Banks, who himself is very explosive. He was PFF's 4th pass blocking offensive tackle in college this year. I like him a lot in wide zone. He's capable in power runs as well. I would not cater whatsoever to the scheme of Mr. Schottenheimer. I do think there's that chance that Jerry Jones, in his, probable Alzheimer's mental decline, that, he deliriously thought he was his dad and, was like, that he's been pretty good through the years. Let's go with him. So there's that. I don't think Schottenheimer matters at all in this equation. We're going with the best player, hopefully, to get the Cowboys on the right track. They've kind of been on the skid here for a bit, and I hope Banks can turn that around some. All right, for the Dolphins, they're a team that you're probably not pounding the table for Ashton Genty for. so I have a little bit of a reprieve there. You know, they do have a great situation at running back and also a little bit, a slot receiver maybe with Devon Achane. He had like the worst average depth of target you're ever going to see for a receiver, like genuinely like zero, just getting screens all the time. But, it produced a little bit. Either way, Genty, I don't think is really, thought here for anybody, but especially me who doesn't really value running backs like that. But I do value defensive backs. And I like Malachi Starks a lot. I got on the train with him this year. I think he's been, a good player for a bit now. But yeah, Starks, he's a do-it-all safety. He's great in coverage. He has great instincts and ball skills. Going back to Bengal, the YouTuber again, he gave him a Jesse Bates comp, which Jesse Bates I don't think is always recognized for being as good as he is, because he's actually like, probably top 3 safety, I would say with better conviction than I alluded to. There's some guys that are definitely in the mix alongside him, but I think Bates, the minimum is definitely top 5. He plays in like the most valuable way for a safety if you're not just going to play every single position like Kyle Hamilton does, which matters a lot as well. Bates just completely shuts down the pass game. Starks, I think, can do a similar thing as a ball hawking free safety. But I also do think, you can put him in the box, you can put him maybe at nickel. I think he can really do a lot of different things. And this is definitely a pick that's kind of wonky because the Dolphins just let Javon Holland go, who is a great safety in his own right. I think that was just, a money thing. Maybe they were like, hey, Malachi Starks will fall to us. We'll draft him. I doubt that. But yeah, Starks, great player, is, I think, pretty steadily the best player at this position, especially when you factor in, the next best players for me are edge rushers. The Dolphins are very good at edge rusher. They got like too many, if anything, if that's even a thing. You could think Kenneth Grant, they do need some defensive interior help. You could argue defensive interior matters more than safety, but I think Starks can be a transformative piece, and I think he's more ready and shown more stuff to this point than Grant has. All right, next for the Colts. They're a tough cookie because they are kind of in no man's land and like every way imaginable. They are good at a lot of places. They're not great at like any of them. Overall, they're just a very mediocre team, as evident by them having pick 14. They're really at a loss for an identity, unless you just consider being very balanced an identity. I personally do not. So they're kind of a ball of clay, and this is a pick that they would like. They do value athletic abilities a lot. We're going to go with James Pierce Jr. Pierce Jr., he is super freaky athletic, as a lot of these guys are, honestly. He ran a 4.440. I don't remember exactly what the last number was. I probably should have gone and checked that out, but I just heard 4.440 for an edge rusher, and I was like, yep, I like him. That's the entire rationale for this pick, in fact. Not really. There's also the fact that he's 245, so he's not, a light edge. He could definitely add some weight and some strength, but as it stands now, he plays strong. He has great burst. He has great potential. He can develop even more as a run defender. The biggest knock, though, against him is potentially one that is, nothing, is that he seems to be an immature person. I don't, know what to make of that. If you find out like stories about him that are confirmed true somehow, it's kind of hard to. But, if you find out, like, exactly what it is and it's not great, yeah, I guess you can be a little bit standoffish with him, but, you hope you can get him to be the best player that he can as a pro. He definitely has a ton of talent. I'll take him over, a sexual assaulter like Mike Green. So next, for the Falcons, you do, think of the memes. Do you go Ashton Genty to pair up with Bijan Robinson and Tyler Algier? Just try to go for the all running back team. That'd be a lot of fun. It would lead to no success for sure, but it'd be a lot of fun. No, I'm going to go with someone who's, dang, PFF does not like him. I didn't realize just how low they were on him. My goodness, he's like the 8th edge. He's like, 12 picks below, so this is a major reach in their mind. Shamar Stewart. There's definitely a real chance that Stewart does not pan out, so that's not a great way to start out the, affirming that this is a good pick. So if he doesn't, though, the Falcons continue their great run of, drafting and signing and trading for bad edge rushers to keep that rich history alive. Stewart, he does have some real upside, though, in that he's lost 25 pounds and he's still ginormous. He was 290 in college. Now he's 265. That does raise some questions, though. Is he an edge rusher? Is he a defensive interior? What is he exactly? 290, you can definitely play on the interior nowadays, especially. 265 on the edge. That's big. So it's a little bit weird, but he's still a great athlete. 290 on the edge. The Rams would say play him at edge. Michael Hoyt, shout out. Shamar Stewart, though, really good first step. The best bull rush in this draft. Really his only move. So that, again, is a bit questionable since he was 290 on college. How's the strength? Going to look at 265. Overall, though, great for stunts and twist, anything of that nature. He's got speed. He's got power. He can knock offensive linemen to the ground. I think Stewart is a very logical pick for Atlanta. They desperately need edge rusher for like the 29th year in a row. He's my best, edge at that pick. I know PFF doesn't agree, but listen to me, don't listen to them. All right, next for the Cardinals. They've needed, this position for about as long as Atlanta's needed an edge rusher. Kenneth Grant, the defensive interior, is going to fill the need for their interior help. Grant is a mythological type of being, which that verbiage got put into my mind by the great Brett Kollmann. Just shouting out all the YouTubers now. Grant is 340 pounds. That's ginormous Ganchwin. And he's quick for his size. So I like that. Right now, as you would probably expect, he's a great run defender. Nose tackle type of guy. You don't really run base formations anymore in the modern games, just nickel for everybody. But, that also is valuable then with being a run defender because you don't have, the heaviest bodies out there. So him being a run defender actually helps you in the pass game as well. You can stay in nickel all the time. Grant definitely has some serious pass rush potential as well. He's very strong, he's very big, so he's going to push the pocket at a great level, I think, regardless. But, if he works on his moves some, I think he's, really got a great potential. Some people are, abnormally high on him, in my opinion, like Samuel Monson, who used to work for PFF and is now on the 33rd team, I believe it is. You can just search up Sam Monson. But he's like, I'd draft him basically anywhere if you need a defensive interior. That's a little bit out of context, but like that's kind of what he was getting at. I'm not quite there with Grant. I do think, you know, if there's a better player at maybe a more valuable position or just, similar in both regards, go there. Grant isn't like, my first thought for basically anybody. But, the Cardinals, they do definitely need some defensive line help. And Jonathan Gannon, who has played around with some really good defensive linemen in his days with Philly, not really with the Cardinals all that much. I think he'll figure out some stuff to do with Grant. So, he's kind of a Jordan Davis type coming out of college where it's, a lot of size, a lot of power, a lot of, athletic traits, just run D monster. And you hope for the pass rush stuff to come. So that's a, I think kind of reasonable comparison for him. Also, if that Darius Robinson dude, their first round pick that they reached on last year, if he comes, into play as a defensive interior or maybe as a big edge, you got some serious beef, just absolute monsters on the line that are able to do multiple things. That'd be pretty cool. All right, the Bengals, at the halfway mark now. Do you go running back? The Bengals don't really believe in defense. It's a bit against their religion. So, do you just double down and say we're going to score 100 million points a game instead of, 900 and whatever? That doesn't check out. Don't listen to me. But yes, you think in running back here. The Bengals do kind of need a running back. They have, the rest of the offense pretty well set. They don't care about the offensive line. That ain't no thing. So, what do you do here? You don't go running back. They have too many needs. Genty's going to fall to like the 7th round at this point. Where you do go, rather, and what you do is you go with the, second best edge rusher according to PFF in a pretty decent reach. They're 26th guy at 17. You go with Michael Williams. I hope it's Michael, not Michael. I said both. I was right, no matter what, unless it's something else. Williams, I've definitely grown to like him. He is such a freak. He's 6'5", 265. Great athlete. He's got long arms. He is super good with his burst as well and as a run defender. He's not, just the type of Georgia defensive player that, gets DUIs or has no production in college and plays in a weird scheme that just doesn't correlate at all to the pros. No, Williams, he's doing real football stuff and he's excelling at it. He can definitely, develop some pass rushing stuff. He's not quite there yet, but he's a great ball of clay to work with. And he played injured in 2024 and was still a baller. So, I just think the sky's definitely the limit for him. I do see the risk in, drafting a player that's a lot of athlete and not currently a lot of pass rusher at the edge position. But, edge is definitely a position that athleticism does matter a lot. Probably the position it matters most for. You could definitely argue some other positions, but, edge rusher definitely in the mix. The Bengals need help on defense. They need basically A to Z there. Williams is definitely in the mix for the best player here. And, he's something that they need. All right, so the Seahawks, you do have, the option of going with another slot receiver just to really meme it up and, just disrespect the game a little bit with JSN, Cooper Kupp, and say Luther Burden. Just, go 3 slot receivers and tell them figure it out. I'm not going to do that. I am, however, going to go with a wide receiver. Josh Simmons, definitely somebody that could come to mind. Abraham Lucas, not a guarantee at tackle, but he did flash, early on in his career. Donovan E. from Boston College. I can't say that last name. I'm bad with names. He's definitely, somebody that would also make sense. They do not have a great edge situation, and Donovan is great. There's no doubt about it. But, you want to give Darnold a fighting chance. I don't think there's necessarily an offensive line pick here that makes perfect sense for them, because I do think, you're projecting Lucas and Cross as your two standbys, and, do you move Simmons to guard? Do you say Lucas as guard? I don't really like that all that much. We're going with Matthew Golden here. Golden is pretty well built. He's definitely not, a string bean. 6 foot, 195. He is crazy athletic. Lots of great athletes in this class. It's fun. He ran the 40 in 4.29. That's awesome. He's very athletic, just based on that pretty much alone. And in addition to that, his acceleration in particular is just really good, out of this world type of levels. I've been a bit conflicted on him because I've seen some people that are like, oh, he runs these great routes. And I've seen some people that are like, I don't really like it all that much. And honestly, from what I've seen, I'm not this expert on like the technical side of route running. Many would argue I'm not this expert on anything, football or otherwise. But yeah, I'm not like overly impressed with his routes as it stands now. And again, that is something I highly value. But regardless, he does separate. I think he has a really good floor as, hopefully at a minimum being a wide receiver too. With his speed, he's an absolute burner and he's an outside guy. Whereas, the other wide receivers that are available, they're primarily slots, and don't get me wrong, they could definitely play outside. But with most of my picks, I am going to prefer a guy that has done so at the college level already, and it's not just strictly projection. Golden, definitely projection insofar as you want to see him clean up his routes a little bit, but he's got a great baseline just based on how athletic he is. He's got good hands for the most part. I think he's a good pick here for Seattle. All right, next for the Bucs, I again get a little bit of a reprieve from not drafting Genty. They don't need a running back. So what we're going to do is, I think, a pick that the Bucs might do if he's available. PFF doesn't think he will be. Jahad Campbell. Burden would make some sense in that they do need, I think, a third wide receiver. But Burden is a slot guy to this point, and Chris Godwin is also a slot. We're not Seattle. We're not going to run 5 slot receivers on the field. We're too classy for that. We're a real organization in Tampa here. So Jahad Campbell is a big linebacker at 245. And honestly, he just checks basically every box. He's got the size. He's good in coverage. He's a good blitzer. That matters with Todd Bowles. I don't know if Todd Bowles is necessarily the guy moving forward, but if you have somebody that likes to blitz, calling the shots on defense, you can do some stuff with Campbell. He can also cover if he's not the blitzer. Very solid versus the run. And again, that's something that is sustainable with his 245 frame. He has good, but I wouldn't say great anticipation, but overall he's pro ready. So I do think, this is just the perfect merging of, the best player at a position of need. I think that's definitely Campbell. All right, what do we do here, Broncos Nation? Do we pass up on Genty once again? Type in the comments section. I'm not going to listen to you because this video is going to be released before I see your comment. So, the thing with Genty that you have to remember, the Boise State, are they the Mustangs? I think so. Boise State Broncos? I don't know. That doesn't totally sound right. Neither sounds totally right. Either way, they have a horsey mascot or, thumbnail for their symbol on PFF. I think that's just their, team icon or whatnot. The Broncos, they logically have a Bronco as, their symbol. That's too much for me to deny. I don't care that, Genty is PFF's 5th best player and, he's last at a 20. That's not really a concern of mine. I just like the horse connection. Some other things that I like, to a lesser extent, is that, hilariously enough, I do have Genty in high regard. I just don't value running back, at all. But Genty, as a player, in conversation for the best player in this draft, yes, very low end competition, but, we're not holding it against Travis Hunter or Shedeur Sanders that, they played nobody. And, Boise State's not too far off from Colorado. So there's that. And, Genty did play just an absolutely stacked Oregon team. He beat the brakes off them basically by himself. Even though Boise State lost, it wasn't Genty's fault at all. He averaged 3 yards more per attempt than any other, or the average was for Oregon, rather. Genty's really good. He's super explosive. He's a big play threat. That is the absolute meta nowadays. Getting chunk plays. If you can get that from the running back, that's great. Very good balance and vision. The only thing going against him is he's the least important full-time position. So, with that said, the Broncos, I love this fit. Sean Payton can, get him involved in a lot of ways. He can be like an Alvin Kamara type, but with more juice. That's pretty high praise. Kamara is definitely one of the best running back in, recent memory. But Genty, honestly, projects that highly. He's that good. So I think, Genty, he can take some pressure off Bo Nix. The team honestly doesn't really need much work, so that makes this make sense. Get the running back cherry on top. We saw, Barkley and Henry really thrive with good situations and, not be as good elsewhere. You can see similar things with Genty. They have a good offensive line as well. You could consider Burden, but I just think the talent and, with what the Broncos are going to do, I think it just makes more sense to go with Genty because the receiving room for the Broncos honestly isn't bad. So I like Genty here to the Broncos. He's not going to fall to being an unrestricted free agent or undrafted free agent, rather. He is going to get drafted. All right, at 21, there's a pick here that's a very, very, slam dunk type of deal. The Steelers, their biggest need, quarterback. There is a quarterback, still available in Shedeur Sanders. Does it make too much sense to turn down? Yes. Or no. Whatever makes more sense. I don't go Sanders here. I don't think particularly highly of Sanders as a player, or as a person for that matter. But I'm not letting that influence. I'm just looking strictly at the player. I drafted Mike Green, who's a way worse dude than Sanders. So the Steelers, running back, definitely needed. We're not going back-to-back running backs. We're not like that. This is also just not another running back worth this pick, in my opinion. Then they need, PFF saying tackle and safety. That's a bit odd. Safety, definitely not a need. They have one of the best safety duos in the league. They just added Juan Thornhill. That's a bit peculiar to me. Tackle I can definitely see. So, Josh Simmons makes some sense. Again, you can meme around a little bit. You can draft Donovan E. from Boston College. Just run 4 edge rushers on the field at all times. See what happens. Definitely not good things, but it'd be fun. Luther Burden, perfect fit. Blend of, him being a slot receiver to this point. Just adding another freak athlete to the Steelers offense with Pickens and Metcalf. Really just get some athletic dudes out there. I'm thinking the same thing, but in a different way. I'm going with a guy for slot receiver, but I'm not going with a guy that's, listed as a slot receiver. I'm also ignoring the next guy that's listed as a slot receiver in Emeka Egbuka. Both very reasonable picks, don't get me wrong. I'm going with Colston Loveland. What? Tight end? The Steelers are great at tight end. You got Pat Freiermuth and one of the best of all time at a very young age, even Darnell Washington. It's just a great, run blocker and super athlete at like 600 million feet tall. Big guy. Tight end doesn't seem like a need. One, Pat Freiermuth, not going to stop me from drafting tight end. Maybe Freiermuth from like 3 years ago would. Muth, much longer, exaggerated Muth for Steelers fans. He hasn't really been doing much of anything lately. And that's not just, with Wilson and Fields not really targeting tight ends like that. The advanced stats on him, like PFF, saying like how open is he, not looking good, just not clicking like he once was. So Loveland, if he ends up being a tight end, I think you just get off Freiermuth. I think he's a good bit overpaid, honestly. But also, Loveland projects as a slot receiver. I don't understand why players don't get listed as the position they play the most at, but Loveland played more than 50% of the time at slot receiver. The rest was mainly wide receiver and then tight end. So, true receiving type of guy. Think of, a Travis Kelce situation. Yes, a tight end, but only a name, not really much of a blocker, more of a route runner, receiver type. I'm not saying that he's going to be as good as Kelce, but there's some resemblance, honestly. He's a bit undersized. Kelce's a little bit on the smaller size as well for like a conventional tight end. Loveland is smooth and a great athlete. Kelce once was that. He's no longer that. He's washed up. But, Travis Kelce-esque in routes and movement, I feel. The biggest thing with Kelce is he just has this extraordinary ability to find holes in zones and just be, running the right route at the right time because, he's so good. He might just be, picking routes as he goes along, which is honestly a theory. It's not just something I'm throwing out there. So that's, something you don't see necessarily in Loveland, but in movement and routes themselves, there's definitely some stuff there. This would just be such a baller, fun to watch offense in that you got Loveland, who's I think 6'3", Pickens, who's like 6'4", Metcalf, who's 6'4". Don't have a lick of a quarterback, but, Loveland keeps the size theme going, actually gets a route runner in there, someone that can play slot. Funny, the tight end is the route runner in this situation. The guy listed as a tight end at least. Loveland is the pick here. He also had better yards per route run than any of the slot receivers, and I think, playing tight end and outside receiver is harder than just strictly being a slot guy. So for the Chargers, Mike Ryen was my least favorite pick to this point because he's scum. This is probably my next least favorite insofar as I like it, but I don't love it like the other picks. We're going to go with edge rusher slash linebacker, Jalen Walker. PFF not really a fan of all that much, which I think is very fair. Honestly, he's definitely a walking red flag. You do have, the Georgia scum potential where, he just might get a DUI at any point. He also is one of those guys that didn't really produce on defense for them, also doesn't really play a real position. He was in between positions as an edge rusher and as a linebacker. There is like a super real chance this dude ends up sucking. But we are at the point of the draft where, you run that risk. And yes, Walker has that very real chance, but man, he's got super high upside. And I think this fit makes a lot of sense because Jesse Minter's like one of the best defensive minds in the game. Hopefully you keep him around a little bit so you at least have one good coach in Los Angeles because, the head coach and the OC are not good. But Walker, super athletic and very strong. Rare combination. Meh, 32-inch arms. Not really a plus in his favor. Hence me saying meh. Poor as a run defender. And in coverage. You don't love to see that. You also don't love to see that he has no pass rush plan at all right now. He kind of just runs into dudes and sees what happens. And, sometimes that works because he just is so athletically gifted in basically every facet. But, he is going to need to learn some pass rushing stuff. In comes, Jesse Minter, Khalil Mack, one of the best edge rushers of recent memory. And even Tuli, I forget how to say his last name. I once knew it. I forgot, though. Tuli T, let's call him the other edge rusher for the Chargers. That's a really, really good, foundation to teach an edge rusher. I think he does project better as an edge rusher. Again, he's not really good at any facet of the game currently. He's just absolutely 100% a ball of clay, which I generally don't fall for. But in a situation like this with the Chargers, there's not really a logical receiving option because you got the slot situation figured out with McConkey. You got, just a good situation, or not just a good. I was trying to say something else, and then I thought about it. You have a fantastic situation at offensive tackle, so that takes out, Josh Simmons. There's a lot of, great players at positions you just absolutely 100% do not need. Edge rusher is definitely a position you could, because Mac, he's 34 years old. Surprisingly enough, unlike everybody else, he's not getting younger, and Walker, if he figures out this, football thing, he honestly could be the next Khalil Mack. And I know that's ridiculous to say, but he's like, I would say in that same caliber of athlete. I haven't looked at their like RAS scores, relative athletic scores, but what I know is Walker is crazy athletic. It jumps off, the page for you. I don't know why he's on a page, not a screen. But, it's very visible. He's got one of the best combinations of speed and strength out of, honestly, any edge rusher that's come out for a while now. There's been a lot of freaks, even in this class. So, someone like that franchise guy who I mentioned a lot early, didn't mention at all recently, TFG has him as a second round type of player. I perfectly understand that. Don't get me wrong. I could definitely see even just that edge rusher, Donovan E. from Boston College. You could definitely project more outcomes that are good than you can with Jalen Walker. But, again, if Jalen Walker hits, he's like best edge rusher in the league capabilities. I don't see so much from Donovan E. So, just different things. And, Walker, maybe for the time being, you play him more as like a linebacker because you need more at linebacker than you do with edge rusher. But, maybe you put him as the third edge rusher. You get him in sometimes with 3 edge packages. I fully trust Jesse Minter. He's an absolute guru, I believe. So, I think that and the supporting cast will get a lot out of Walker. Speaking of Donovan E, I hope I didn't badmouth him any, because that was not intended. I like him quite a bit. I do realize PFF has him going, as the 16th guy. He falls to 23, but he falls no further. I just really didn't see like a perfect alignment of player to team. But here, I see absolutely that. The only thing that is against Donovan is that he's not the ideal height. I value wingspan, arm length, more than height. I don't think he's like particularly anything in those regards. But being 6'2" instead of like 6'4", I know that doesn't sound like a huge deal, but like, 6'4" and up is definitely the prototype. 6'2" is definitely on the lower end for an edge rusher. He could also, add a little bit more strength and play with a little bit more power. But he's got a good build, aside from that, being 247 pounds, has exceptional bend and quickness, very productive in college. His edge ranks this year were 6th in pressure and 3rd in stops. Definitely, to me, projects as a guy that's going to be, just jumping out the gates hot. I think this is a perfect matchup. You get, Donovan, who is just, I think, total refinement. Rashawn Gary, some refinement, a lot more, power and speed and athletic abilities. You can just, dominate offensive tackles by, putting the better technician against the worst pass blocker and putting the, better power guy on the weaker tackle. I think you get great results with this. It's a good clash of styles for the edge rushers, and they do desperately need edge. So that's, I think, a very good pick for the Packers. That's why I made it. It's not because I, want them to fail. All right, the next thing for the Vikings, you have, I think the best players around here are Josh Simmons. You don't need tackle. I think you start thinking about Shador around here. You get Nick Emenwori. I think Nick makes some sense, but I just don't think he's the caliber of player that Luther Burden is. It's nice he's already, at the top, so I don't have to scroll anywhere and mess up, potentially. Burden, I've held it against him a little bit that he's a slot wide receiver. In this case, that's perfect, because the Vikings with Jordan Addison and Justin Jefferson, they got a pretty good thing going at outside receiver, believe it or not. You could argue that this is overkill, but I just don't see, the blending of talent and need really anywhere else. They do definitely need a slot receiver. Naylor was not really doing it. Burden, he's, I think, rather well built. He's 5'11", 205 pounds. I like that for a slot. He ran the 40 in 4.41 seconds. That's really good. Especially, too, like I said, he's not, like, light. He's built. He's very explosive and fast. He didn't have any resemblance of a quarterback his last year, at least. I don't know about the prior years, but this year, no quarterback in sight from Missouri. What I like a lot about him is that he led college football in missed tackles forced. You get these speedy, tough to tackle guys in Jefferson. I mean, Jefferson's just great at everything. So I'm not trying to say that's like what he specifically is, but between Jefferson, Burden, even Hawkinson a little bit, these guys are tough to bring down, and, they have a lot of skill. On top of that, I love Burden as a slot, and he's going to play slot. There's potential for him to move outside if needed, but, for the most part, just put him at slot and get good things. I would have liked to consider an interior offensive lineman here because I do think that's still, left guard, I think could use some help. Not just like a super glaring weakness, and it is a less important position than receiver in my eyes. I think that's actually kind of indisputable. But yeah, Burden, you're giving McCarthy everything he needs to succeed. There's not going to be one receiving option that isn't at least good if Burden, is anything. All right. For the Texans, they put themselves in a little bit of a situation by trading away, far and away their best offensive lineman in Laramie Tunsil and, Cam Robinson. I like the idea of, if you trade Tunsil and just get 5 solid starters in his place, that's a great move. Right now, they don't really have that. They just traded away their best guy and they, kind of replaced him with a solid guy in Robinson, but there's still a lot to be done. And Josh Simmons is, I think, a very good player. That would make a ton of sense here, and we're going to go with him. Ohio State connection between him and Fields. You could argue for Egbuka. They do definitely need wide receiver help, and I'm a fair bit lower on Egbuka than I am Simmons. I don't think Egbuka is bad by any stretch, but, again, slot receivers are easier to find than wide receivers or outside wide receivers. And Simmons really has the potential to be a franchise tackle. He has great upside. He's a great athlete. I think he's undervalued a fair bit due to injury. I know I didn't draft him even as highly as PFF thinks I should have, but again, that wasn't like me trying to avoid him, really. Yeah, I think just in general, he's a little bit undervalued due to the injury, but he should be healthy day one, roughly, and you love to see that. Hopefully he is. Hopefully he's ready to go and comes out strong. I think Simmons makes a lot of sense to the Texans. All right, next for the Rams. This is kind of a deal where it's like, what do you get the man who has everything? Because I know PFF is out here saying you need tight end, tackle, linebacker, and corner, but they be lying. Tight end, yeah, I agree. Higbee's old and, not a sure thing to be a plus starter these days. Linebacker, can definitely see that. Tackle, plan it for Havenstein after he retires, but who knows when that's going to happen. Alaric Jackson, you got a really good tackle there. I don't really, fully understand the tackle need. Cornerback, I can kind of see. Kind of hard to address cornerback, though. For me, the best player that, means anything is, according to PFF at least, man, there's just not, oh my goodness. Yeah, I just keep scrolling. It's like, we're going to eventually get to the guy I probably should have just, searched for him. We're going to stop the slide on Shedeur. Sanders, very, very divisive prospect. Probably the most divisive in this class. PFF, lower on him than I am. The consensus draft board, which is a really good gauge for at least, getting a vibe on where players will go, has him as, I believe, currently the 4th player in the draft. So right there's a 42 pick range. You could maybe see a 42 pick range for 7th to undrafted round type of players, but top 5 pick to 46 is just crazy. The average draft position being 17, that's kind of like in line with where I'm at with him. By no means do I think he is a great prospect. I also don't like that he throws his teammates under the bus. He didn't have a good offensive line at Colorado, but one, you play at Colorado, what do you expect? Two, you're playing for Colorado, thereby you're not really playing good schools, so you're not like going against, Nick and Joey Bosa and Myles Garrett and Micah Parsons and TJ Watt, on the same team. Sanders, yeah, he didn't have a good offensive line, but it wasn't unusable. It's actually above average according to PFF. So we're going back to that franchise guy. Well, he had a very astute observation comparison, if you will, for Sanders, in my opinion. I like this one a lot. I had to dig deep to find it because I saw so many comparisons that just were not resonating with me. But then this one I saw and it's like, that's it. He said on the low end, you get Teddy Bridgewater for Sanders, which, to put it in like numeric terms, Bridgewater was like an average quarterback when he was healthy. So let's say, the 17th best quarterback. At the high end, you get Brock Purdy. Let's say like, the 11th best quarterback in the league. You can broaden that out to really, be inclusive and make sure you get it right. But I definitely see him in that 11 or so to 17 or so range. I do definitely think 11's harder to project, but I can see a world, especially with quarterbacks always changing year to year, and with the Rams, you have such a great foundation in place with Sean McVay, who is just an absolute guru of a coach. I think there is a fair complaint on him that he might run a little bit much. I know the thought there is that he's setting up the pass and getting an idea of what the defense is in and going to do. You can also get a gauge of what the defense is going to do when you pass. Believe it or not, I think it's even easier to see actually as the coverage actually unfolds and players just don't get their run fits. So yeah, you got McVay. Even though I threw a little mud on his name, great coach, elite coach. You have a really sound offensive line for right now. You might need a right tackle of the future. You got elite, maybe the best receiving duo, maybe the best receiving trio in the league with Puka Nacua, who I think is still somehow underrated. He's, I think generally regarded as being a great receiver at this point, but in yards per route run, he was like a half a yard in front of the nearest receiver. He was at 3.5, I want to say, maybe 3.6. The next closest was at 3. So that's a big dang deal. And, Puka can do it from all over the place. Devontae Adams, still really good. Tutu Atwell, only on a 1-year deal, but, really good player as well. So, yeah, Sanders, I think, could definitely be, in that mix with how good the team is. He can put up those numbers. Regarding Sanders as a player, I know I've talked about everything but that to this point. Meh, athlete, and arm. I don't think there's, a way around that. That's why his comps are Bridgewater and Purdy. He doesn't impress me, at all in those regards. Generally regarded as being this just, super accurate, on point quarterback. I think he's got good accuracy. I don't think he has, earth-shattering accuracy. I also think he has good processing, not necessarily, elite. He can definitely figure out, though, in a pretty quick manner what the defense is in, where the holes are going to be. I think he's pretty sound in that regard. The last thing I have on him is he doesn't really throw with anticipation, which that paired with the lacking arm talent is a really bad combination. He's going to have to learn to throw with anticipation. So, yeah, there's a lot, wrong with him. And I do definitely, show that by him going number 26. But, I have him still in the first round for a reason. Not just, quarterback matters the most and the Rams don't have these glaring needs. Sanders, he is pretty darn good under pressure, honestly. And, he was facing a good amount of pressure. Some created by himself for not always, getting rid of the ball because he's, really trying not to get turnovers. You could argue that's a good thing because he's not turning the ball over. You could argue that's a bad thing because he's not, being as aggressive as he could be. Regardless, he's handling the pressure pretty well. Again, he's reading the zone well. He's not a bad athlete and he doesn't have a bad arm. He's not, Kenny Pickett arm mixed with Tom Brady legs. He's not that at all. I think, the Rams, you don't want to just blindly do the same thing and hope to get the same results. You want better results anyways than what the 49ers got, but the Rams saw what, Brock Purdy was able to do on his rookie contract. You get a Super Bowl that, you play one of the best versions of the best team in, a pretty darn long time. You get it to where you lose on a touchdown in overtime when you got a field goal in overtime. They also got to an NFC Championship game that they lost. That's, that's a really good place to be. Obviously, you want to win a Super Bowl every year, but, they were in position to be there. The Rams saw it. So, the Rams, I think, can be honestly in a similar situation. You get the rookie contract quarterback that doesn't wow you with, any physical traits, but is good mentally and, just a great supporting cast all around. You're able to do big things. All right. For the Ravens, I know I've talked about the picks that I don't really like. I haven't really talked about the picks that I do like. That's because I like basically every other pick. I'm pretty darn high on this draft overall, I would say. I want more star talent than what we get. I want to see, the best player at every position for all 32 picks, hopefully. But, this is pretty all right. There's good depth as well. So this is one of my favorite picks, though, of the draft, just because I really had to use a lot of brain power and think critically, galaxy brain this one a little bit. So with the Ravens, you definitely, think guard. This is the part of the first round where you can reasonably think interior offensive line, unless they're just a generational talent. Then you can be a little bit earlier. Baltimore, they kind of need it. They kind of don't. Van Noy and Owe is a really good duo right now. Yes, you could use a third guy. Yes, Van Noy is old. You don't, have the perfect situation, but right now, edge is not really a need. What I see most and what I agree with most is the need for defensive back. And honestly, don't get me wrong, the Ravens have a good defensive back situation. But I want to make it even better than that because I do believe that coverage matters more than pass rush, even if coverage isn't as consistent year to year as the pass rush is. So what do we do for defensive back? You need, for the Ravens, as, the team projects based on last year's lineup, you need an outside corner. You got Nate Wiggins, great, prospect that they thought ahead with in last year's draft. You drafted him. He looks solid. You have Humphrey in the slot. You have Ardarius Washington, Kyle Hamilton as safeties. Hamilton, just being the Swiss Army knife. But you need that outside corner opposite Wiggins. You let go of Stevens, probably a good move considering the amount of money he got and the type of player he is. So, you look around, you look far and wide, you look high and low, in the middle even. You don't really find an outside corner, for a while. The best available per PFF is Trey Amos, 40th. That's a bit of a reach at 27. I mean, I say that, but the guy we're going to go with is even more of a reach, actually, but I think he's better. We're going to go with Nick Emenwori. I, again, say that, I don't like these hyper athletes that aren't, like super producing in college. My actions speak otherwise because I'm drafting a super hyper athlete at 6'3", 227. That's like, legit on the lighter side, but not even like the lightest linebacker in the league type of weight. And, he's a safety, listed as a safety, but he's played a lot at nickelback. And, I am tempted to put him at nickelback. I think, a 227-pound nickel is pretty hype. And the fact that he's very athletic and, does have experience at nickel, it's not unfounded. So with him, you want to play him in, near the line of scrimmage in the box. He can be, honestly, what I like so much about him is he can just, play off of Kyle Hamilton. I'm not saying Emenwori is going to be, as good or better than Hamilton. Hamilton's an elite safety. But, there's some similarities. They're both long players that can really move around. I don't see Emenwori as much of a deep safety as Hamilton can be, but I think Hamilton's really at his best near the line of scrimmage as well. So you get two guys that you can just move around and, mess around with the offense a bit. And for this to work, the mindset is you draft Emenwori, you put him at nickel, you move Humphrey back to outside corner, and, just great things transpire. I would love to see Emenwori, on some corner blitzes like they did with McDonald and, using his very athletic 6'3", good wingspan, get in the coverage lanes a bit, or the throwing lanes rather, for, some blitzes and get in very quickly. Emenwori as well has some solid ball skills, even though he does, not project really as a deep safety necessarily. He's not bad with playing the ball. And the knock on him is that he's a little bit slow to react, so he doesn't always play, as fast as he can. And he can have some issues with quickness. So, nickel isn't like seamless, but I do think, for the most part, you just refine him a bit. You get him, completely committed to playing the nickel or safety if, he doesn't pan out there. And, you get a 6'3" dude that can press the bejeezers out of, slot receivers, which aren't used to getting pressed. But like at 6'3", I think you can, find a way. And that could make up for some of the quickness issues. I also think it's just, partly a technique thing. And I trust Baltimore to get the most out of their, prospects, because they generally do. I like this pick a fair amount. All right. So for the Lions, I debated this pick a whole bunch because, again, they don't really have needs where the good players are available, or like the best players, because there's still lots of good players. They do definitely need guard. Could kind of use wide receiver, but Ekbuka, and Amon-Ra, the Sun God, St. Brown, don't fit at all. They're both slot players. Why mess with St. Brown, who's, maybe the best slot in the game? Why draft a slot and then move him to outside when he has no, history of playing outside? That's very risky. You don't need defensive interior. You definitely don't need running back, and I don't know if Hampton's like that. The next Best player per PFF and by my board is Gray Zabel. Listed as tackle, gonna move him inside to interior, not just because they need guard and they don't need tackle. It's because Zabel has 32-inch arms, below the 33-inch threshold that I've talked about 100 million times at this point. Zabel, though, that's about the only knock on him because he's a great athlete for an offensive line. He has, just such a great potential for wide zone blocking schemes, but he can do power for sure. He could add some power and strength to his game. That was kind of the same thing. I meant physicality and strength. But, there's already a lot of that on the lines. It's not like, he's going to be tasked with being the only guy that can provide that. Zabel, though, just adds some elite athletic ability, fills a need, really good in pass protection. I think he can be a sensational guard. So that's the pick for the Lions. The next for the Commanders, they are weird because they're picking 29th, and I kind of thought of them like I did the Saints, where it's like, needs everything except for quarterback and a wide receiver, left tackle, so it's not exactly as I postured, but it's pretty darn close. They need a lot of different things. So, wide receiver, I hate to say it because I do value receiver a lot. You kind of just say, Jaden, do what you did last year, even better, or at least the same this year. And we'll be pretty good at wide receiver because, Terry McLaurin is a very solid, I think sometimes maybe a little bit overstated, but a very solid receiver. There's a lot of people that think he's underrated, but there's so many that think he's underrated. I think he's actually kind of overrated. Just you look at the production pre-Daniels, and I know he didn't have great quarterbacks, but there's lots of receivers that haven't had great quarterbacks that did better. So I think McLaurin's a sound receiver. I don't think he's a high-end wide receiver one. So you could look to pair some more talent. They did, I think, make a really bad move for Deebo Samuel. A fifth is basically nothing, when you're a good team, but they're not particularly a good team. They just had a good year. So, I don't like trading a pick there, and I also don't like paying Deebo Samuel top of the line money when he hasn't been elite since 2021. He's really, just been kind of declining all over the place. Noah Brown, though, is solid. So it's just Egbuka, you could argue, is the best player available. You could argue, they do need receiver, and they're going to need it more when, Samuel leaves in free agency, perhaps following the year. But for me, Walter Nolan, definitely in the mix for best player, and definitely a need. You let go of your best defensive lineman and Jonathan Allen, who was hurt, but, Allen projected as their best guy. Doesn't defend the run at a high level, hasn't for a while. But, Deron Payne, that used to be his thing. He didn't do that well at all this year. They got Johnny Newton. They drafted a guy last year pretty highly. Didn't really do anything. So it's you don't have a great situation. Defensive line, honestly, if Payne plays like he did last year, this upcoming year, probably try to get rid of him, save some money there. Nolan, I like a fair amount. You could definitely also consider Derek Harmon as another defensive interior. I think Harmon arguably is the better player because Harmon's more of the pass rusher than Nolan is, and that matters more. But Nolan, great run defender, which they desperately need. They don't really have a good run defending situation going. He also has a lot of pass rush upside. That's not just me saying he's athletic or whatever, but he's shown in spurts some pass rushing capabilities. He's got good power, which helps, of course, and he does have some moves already. Going back to the Bengal well this time, Geno Atkins was the comp for Nolan. Of course, that's a very high-end comp. Another, Bengal player being comped. Fitting coming from Bengal. His favorite team is the Bengals. I know that's not true, but anyways. Nolan, I think, just good mix. The best player. And they do need it. So we're going with him. Next for the Bills, there's definitely the thought in your head of going Egbuka here, but you don't want to entirely predicate on what you have right now because it can change very quickly. Wide receiver does matter a lot. He is a good player, but the Bills don't need wide receiver like that, and especially a wide receiver like that. So by that I mean that Khalil Shakir was, primarily a slot. Egbuka, again, primarily a slot. That just doesn't fit very well. The Bills, for some reason, try to take the ball out of Josh Allen's hands a whole bunch. I like that in the regular season. Try to preserve him from getting hit, prolong his career as much as you can. He's not old, of course, but the hits add up after a while. So I like, running a good bit in the regular season, not running him in the regular season, just save that for the playoffs when it really matters. And somebody that can help with running and, hopefully prevent some hits on him as a passer as well is Tyler Booker. Let's see. I don't know exactly where he, 48. That's a bit of a reach per PFF. Hey, at least the average draft, people got me having him nearby at 34. So Booker, he is, again, one of these players that I allegedly don't like. Maybe I actually do like them and I just don't know it yet. He's a bit of projection. He's got, really good power and is, in a power scheme just going to dominate people, not so much in zone. He's a good run blocker that has peaked as number 52 in PFF's guard ranks. So that's a bit worrying that, he is someone that's based on athleticism and there's not great athletes in college like there is the NFL, even at Alabama. But, there's a lot of people that know as much or more than I know about football that like Booker. So I'm going to kind of defer to them a little bit. And I'll also just say, they do need guard. There's not really like a super easy, pick here for the Bills. So we're going to go Booker. And next for the Chiefs, who honestly have had a really rough offseason. Nobody likes to, bring it up, but it's been genuinely terrible in basically every way. So we're going to try to fix that a little bit here. They, could use some offensive line help in large part because they just, overpaid Trey Smith a whole bunch and then let go of their second best lineman, Joe Tooney, who's, probably their best pass protector. Very sus stuff going on. So, I don't deny that they need some offensive line help. Egbuka again, in the mix. But you got Rashee Rice, one of their many just bad people in Kansas City that have been around for a while now. Doesn't get brought up either, really. But yeah, you got, a slot receiver already. You don't want to necessarily change things up too much. So what do we do here? We try to find Chris Jones a playmate because we don't know how long Chris Jones is going to be here, either for, money reasons or just how long he's going to be a superstar for, because he's getting up there a little bit. I'm not saying he's prone to retirement, but he's definitely, at the age where you're not guaranteed to be a superstar every year. So we're going to get Derek Harmon. I think, the Chiefs have more needs than a lot of people would realize. I think that was kind of showcased by them just getting bludgeoned by the Eagles. Never really even got in the mix for that game. So Derek Harmon can be, ideally for them, the next Chris Jones. I don't think he's necessarily built the same, but he's also very athletic, and he's a great pass rusher like Jones. He had 11 more pressures than number 2 in the NCAA for interior defensive linemen. And you're like, oh, maybe he just played more. No, he played less than number 2. He had 29 less snaps for pass rushing. And that's just ridiculous, especially at a school like Oregon. They have a good defensive line, so their teams aren't always necessarily double teaming Harmon like that, or just giving him the attention maybe that they should have, because you got to block everybody at the end of the day. But Harmon, he was really, really productive, and he does project well with his athletic abilities. He's also not a scrub against the run, which that's kind of a thing for the Chiefs, is hanging in there with the run. You don't want to have it where Mahomes gets the ball twice in the game and that's it, because the other team just keeps running. So Harmon, I think, makes a lot of sense here. They do need defensive interior. They need edge rusher as well. And this one's set up for us. We finally take Egbuka. I don't really think there's too much of a thought process involved in this one, because I do think Egbuka is the best player. You could argue he's been the best player for a while now. I just really haven't loved any of the fits. Egbuka, 6'1", 205. That's a good build, especially for the slot. Very, very high floor. He has good hands, great routes, and he does have the potential to play outside, but I just don't want to draft him thinking, hey, let's move positions. I'd rather say, do what you've been doing really well at, and, hopefully that keeps going. That franchise guy, this is going to be the last plug for him. He had a great comp for Egbuka as well. He called him a supercharged Jakobi Meyers, which is great in the sense that Jakobi Meyers himself is really good. So you supercharge that, you get a very good prospect at receiver. Again, primarily a slot, but, that's where you need him, in particular with the Eagles, because you can play Smitty at, outside, AJ Brown, of course, at outside, just dominate folks that way. And then you also got to watch, a potentially elite slot in Egbuka. And, if money becomes an issue, which probably won't, because the Eagles are just so expertly ran, they prioritize the right things. Egbuka could become an outside receiver, though, if crap hits the fan, potentially. So Egbuka, I think, makes a lot of sense here. I do like him a lot as a player. I know I didn't really show that by letting him fall as far as I did, but, we finally got him in the first, even if it is with the last pick in the first. So this is the draft. Let's get everybody in sight. Everybody smile for the picture. This is what we end up going with. Let me know where I went wrong. Try to tell me not, 1 to 32, maybe just 1 to 31 or 2 to 32, let's say. But, if I did mess up every pick, let me know. Be sure to let me know why. I think overall, though, this is a pretty, reasonable thing based on positional need, player value, or player skill, and positional value. So I'm going to do probably some videos on more advanced breakdowns on players, which is hard to believe because this is like a 2-hour-long video. So, I might key into some guys a little bit more, so stay on the watch for that. And I'm also not going to just stop with videos in general. I'm going to be making more stuff, so make sure you're subscribed for that. If you made it this far, you're legally obligated to like the video, and again, subscribe. Be sure to comment what your thoughts are on any of the picks, especially if it's your team and I did something just god awful. Be sure to let me know. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again maybe.